Hey, gang. So, we're starting our last unit of the year, and it's a really important one for next year because it details the Great Depression. The real reason you need this is because it's important for the rise of the dictatorships around the world, which is part of paper two, and also their expansion, which is paper one. But more importantly, it's a major function in paper three. And paper three is I'm sorry, I'm trying to block that light. Paper three is the most heavily weighted part of the test. It details the Americas and things that are happening just in the Americas. So from the top of Canada down to the bottom of South America. And so this is largely a U.S. centric unit, much like the Civil War was. But by the time we're done, we do have to know something about how Canada was impacted in particular. So we're going to dive into that and look at the causes of the Great Depression, looking in this presentation at the political and economic causes. So that being said, you're going to probably see some parallels to things that have been going on in our own country recently, and that's fine. So the first thing that happens is we come out of World War One, and after World War One is complete, we don't want to go get involved in another war again. Granted, we weren't over there very long. We declared war in 17, and we had our troops arrive in 18. War is over at the end of the year. It was still expensive, both in terms of financial cost as well as the personnel, who were lost overall, or those who were injured or wounded and came back, less whole than they had been before. So, we got involved in a major foreign adventure for one of the first times in our history, significantly. Gone toe to toe with European powers and really had an expensive go of it. So when Warren Harding gets elected, Woodrow Wilson comes out of office. Warren Harding says, "I'm going to return us to normalcy." And it's a really important phrase, really important thing, because it defines what the country used to be. And the country used to be isolated. The country used to be not engaged in foreign affairs. And we largely wanted to do things, within our country and not worry so much about the outside world. But that outside world is now a lot closer and more intertwined with us in 1920 than it was in 1900, and certainly more than 1800. So, overall, you get the idea that Harding himself, who's not the most active president of all time, there are suspicions his own wife murders him. He dies in office. But he wants to see a smaller government. He wants to see, people spending less on their taxes and things like that, which are traditional Republican values. He basically says, all right, we're going to try and go back to the way things used to be. And the world doesn't operate like that anymore. Of course, there's a lot of factories that were creating things after World War or during World War One that didn't need those things anymore, like rifles or uniforms or a lot of other things. And so again, a lot of people are going to be temporarily kicked out of their jobs. Industries are going to have to retool. People are going to figure out what works. And for a very, very brief period of time, we're talking really brief, unemployment does skyrocket, but it's something that he says, look, we can handle this. As you can see, Harding as president, says, why don't we lower taxes? That'll put more money in people's hands. And by putting more people in money's hands, they're going to spend that money. And by spending that money, that's going to employ the grocery store worker. It's going to employ the guy who maybe, is a carpenter, fixing houses or building houses. Also, we want to make sure that our farmers are protected. They never make a lot of money. They did during World War One. But now they're facing international competition again. And, it's going to drive prices down. The farms are going to be in danger of closing, which, of course, threatens the American food supply. The more people are continuing to move to the city, obviously that's going to take less agricultural workers over time. He also suggests we should reduce immigration. And, again, the primary thinking there is perhaps that it's going to be a strain on social services, dollars that are being spent to take care of people who are not American citizens. They're not contributing yet to the American economy, although that's not going to be accurate. They're going to go to work in jobs and stuff like that as well. But again, his idea is that it's protecting American workers, American jobs, from being taken over by foreigners. He doesn't want foreign introduction of other ideas coming in either. Communism, of course, has just taken root in the Soviet Union. And, there are people in the United States who are not doing well at the time, and maybe more people coming in from overseas would bring those ideas with them. And he wants to guard against that. The 20s is going to be a huge decade worldwide for people who are worried about the rise of communism. You're going to see it happen in the United States to a lesser degree than you see it in Germany and in Japan and in Italy. And those are going to be central features of things we talk about at the beginning of next year. So in 1913, the income tax didn't exactly bring in a lot of money for the United States economy. It does today for the most part. But back then, it wasn't all that significant. So it was brought in because of a constitutional amendment. In 1913, you can see that the richest people in the country in 1913 paid only 7% of their income. Now, during 1916, during the war years, that number was dramatically higher, 77%. 77% of everything you earn, you'd give to the government, and you'd have to survive on 23%, which in a modern day scenario, if you make $100 million a year, you give $77 million to the government, $23 million, you're going to live on that? Probably can do that. It gets reduced down to 25% in 1925. But the income taxes is not going to be something that is relied upon as heavily. We don't have war expenditures that we're worried about. In fact, other countries owe us money, and we'll see more about that coming up. But that's going to be a flow of money back into the country. The Federal Reserve is going to also do something that, previously we haven't had a lot of experience with in the United States. In the 1920s, the word credit becomes a very important word. And as the explosion of consumer goods and mechanical things starts to become more and more accessible, in an effort to keep up with your next door neighbor, the Joneses, everybody's going out and getting these items. And it doesn't mean you can necessarily afford them, but through credit, you're going to. So the Federal Reserve is going to tell banks, we'll loan you money. The banks then tell the customers, we'll loan you money. And they also are going to lower the reserve requirements for banks. And what does that mean? Well, if everybody goes to the bank with their cash and says, here you go to Bank of America or SunTrust or somebody else, for them to have all that cash on hand does two things. Number one, it makes them a tempting target for a robbery. Number two, what it's going to do is it's going to kind of make that money sit there. And, the money needs to flow through the economy. And so technically the banks are going to give most of their cash to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve says, all right, we understand you gave us like $10 million today. And they have basically, the Federal Reserve is kind of like the bank's bank. And the local Bank of America branch knows it has $10 million on deposit with the Federal Reserve Bank and wherever. But when they need to make loans out to people, they've still got that money. They just don't have it on hand. And it makes it a lot easier. But because they lower the reserve requirements, banks themselves get in the habit of having less money on hand than they need. And they're going to loan out more and more and more money. And that's going to cause a problem a little bit later on. Now, Harding dies. Again, there are rumors as to why he dies while he's in office. But as vice president, a New Englander by the name of Calvin Coolidge is going to come in and take his place. He's not interested in really changing anything. He's a party line guy, meaning that the Republican Party lines, he's going to follow those. He really doesn't want to rock the boat. That's not his style whatsoever. He's the only president ever sworn in by his dad, because his dad was a judge. When he found out, Harding had died, he took the oath of office in, I believe it was his dad's kitchen. He's going to continue all the same policies of his predecessor. And you can see here in 1925, Coolidge wants to keep everything on an even-keeled basis. He wants to keep business operating. He says the chief business of the American people is business. They're concerned with buying, selling, investing, and prospering in the world. The primary interest or chief business of the American people is business. It's not self-improvement. It's not making the world a better place or something. Well, apparently it's all about making sure that business is taken care of. And you're going to see that really borne out here soon. So one of the things that Coolidge is going to do is they're going to say, look, the federal government spends too much money. The federal government spends too much money on a number of different things, so I want you to figure out how we can spend less. So what they're going to do is not only are they going to try and spend less, they're also going to try and bring in less. So by 1927, only 2% of Americans are paying income tax. So if you're an average, everyday, middle-class person, you don't have to worry about your income tax. You're spending your money all over the place. People are encouraged realistically to spend with this idea that the chief interest of the American people is business. And as they all go out there and spend, they're not saving, saving, saving. And the banks themselves, even if the people were saving, are getting engaged in things that are going to see them loan more and more percentages of their money out to people, which becomes riskier and riskier in terms of repayments. So by the time that Coolidge is done being president, he's going to be replaced by Hoover in the election of 1928, another Republican. By the time that Coolidge is done, a quarter of the national debt has been repaid in just his short, not even his full term. He's going to do it in 2 to 3 years. In 1925, the government had a surplus, which is a very odd concept in the modern sense. Heck, we can say in the response to the coronavirus, we added in $2 trillion to our debt with the first stimulus package that went out. And it looks like we're about to have a second one. So we're just adding on to the debt. We're spending tons more money than we actually have as a country, because if we don't, the economy will fail. Well, in this case, in the late 1920s, the government was bringing in more money than it actually spent. And they used that to pay down the debt, which is kind of an odd concept. In a modern household, you're supposed to live in your means. You're not supposed to spend more than you bring in. And if you have huge credit card debts, you have some problems. So in this case, they're actually making money every year. They're looking for places to spend it potentially. They don't want to spend it. They do want to bring down the debt. They want to, essentially live within their means. $677 million extra the government brings in than it spends in 1925. In 1927, again, it's $607 million. Imagine a country where they're not going into debt more and more every year. That has to be paid off by future generations. Instead, they're generating what we would call a profit. So, like I said, the chief business of the American, or chief interest of the American person, is basically business, supposedly. So restrictions are off, and government regulations aren't all that strong. And they let businesses do what they want for the most part in a laissez-faire, hands-off, hands-free type environment. There's a lot less regulation than there is today that extends to a lot of different businesses and things that would absolutely shock us today if we had to have those kind of models. But notice Coolidge in 1925 says, "The man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there." Now, I don't know about you, but where I work, I don't worship Suncoast, for example. I appreciate it, don't get me wrong, but this is again reinforcing this idea that the business interests and businesses in general are infallible and doing everything for the American economy to work just right, and they're not self-serving and things like that. But it's going to come back to bite them all soon enough. So during the period of the 1910s and the 1920s, all of a sudden you're going to see the number of electrical goods and innovations just rise dramatically. And you can see some examples of these over on the left-hand side. For example, this over here, there's a stove, but over on the side here, these are going to be areas for refrigeration. I mean, quite literally, at the beginning of the 1900s, it still was not uncommon for people to store things with blocks of ice. During the winter, boys would be paid. It was kind of like in the beginning of Frozen 1. You'd have men and boys go out there to a river, which was frozen solid, and they would cut out big, just chunk blocks of ice. And they would use these huge picks, and look like kind of scissors. And they would bring them to people's houses. They'd cover them with sawdust, and they would put them in the freezer. And that would last all the way through the summer months, and people would open it as little as possible. But the idea was that's what kept everything cold. They hadn't developed refrigeration as we know it today. So there's an example of, a small, example of that going up there on the upper right. Down below that is a traditional, electrical freezer, which again, you didn't have to have the big block of ice that was hauled in. You could use all your storage room for meat or other things. There's a telephone, which again is synonymous with this era, electric clocks, and it's magic. Look at that ad. There's going to be all kinds of things that are going to be coming in to make people's lives more interesting. Think Carousel of Progress on steroids. But in 1912, almost 2.5 million electrical goods were sold. In 1929, 160 million. Now, the population has obviously gone up since then, but let's stop and consider this for a moment. In the case of, I'm not going to use TVs because now we all have plenty of TVs, but things that you only need one of, washing machine, okay, a dishwasher. Once you got one, you generally don't buy a second one, but they're still finding ways to just absolutely just trick out their houses with everything they can possibly think of that's going to be a labor saving device, in particular for the good old American housewife to have an easier life and all this like huger amount of free time. I just said huger, didn't I? That was great. Well, a big thing that's going to be really popular is radios. I just watched, Back to the Future recently with my family, and Marty McFly's he knows it, but the family doesn't. His grandfather wheels in 1955, the family's first television, and he's like, "Oh, it's our first TV," and the younger kid, Marty's uncle to be, says, "Do you have a TV at your house, Marty?" He's like, "Oh yeah, we got like 2 or 3," and he's like, "Whoa, you're rich," and everybody's like, "Oh, they're just kidding. Nobody's got that many." Well, radios were like that in the 1920s. The radios, for example, were the only real form of entertainment, as far as the outside world is concerned. They brought in ball games. They brought in, radio dramas, like we have Law and Order type things on TV. They had comedy shows, which we have comedy, things that are going to be happening, from different TV shows that are going on. And, they got concerts and all kinds of other things. And wherever you lived, as long as you had a radio signal and electrical outlet, you could get this signal and keep in touch with the rest of the world and really, be entertained. This was a huge, huge thing in the 1920s. It really began to take off. And you can see in 1920, $10.7 million were spent on radios. Now, in 1929, $441 million is spent on radios. I want to tell you right now, most radios that people bought, there was only one radio in the house. Radios were large. You could see the unit this woman's operating down in the lower right, but they were also very, very expensive. And for the most part, people could not afford to buy a radio unless they took out a line of credit from a bank. Again, at one point, I remember getting a radio in a cereal box with like a little goofy set of headphones when I was younger. Radios we got them in our cars, we've got them everywhere. And, whether it's, doing something through iTunes or whatever else, but the radio concept itself was just such an amazing thing. Whole families would gather around these things for hours and be entertained, and they would have to imagine in their head what everything looked like. But radios became a huge business. As you can see, again, $441 million in 1929. So in order to get these things made, you need people, and people have to make things. And here's where things start to get really kind of bizarre, because the worker becomes more important because he's cranking out these goods. But at the same time, the worker feels like the benefits of what and I say he because it's probably a man, what he's doing at work is making the business owners rich, maybe the stockholders, but he himself is not benefiting all that much. They're making record profits. But, this turns more people to go, you know what, we need labor unions. Workers are being exploited at times in ways where their safety is compromised. There's a famous fire in New York called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, kills over 100 women who are working there because literally the doors were chained shut and locked by management who didn't want them getting out early. And so there were safety concerns and there was pay concerns and, was this all equitable? So you did see a rise in unions. And as you see a rise in unions, you see potentially more strikes. And if you see more strikes, you have the conservatives looking at a strike at possibly the beginning of a labor movement, which could potentially lead to communism, which, of course, conservatives are afraid of. So there's this battle going on between making sure you pay people the right amount, but also at the same time, the conservatives are like, you know what, we need to hold the line. We started this company, we owned it, we paid for the building and everything else, but we got to control how much we're making. Ultimately, people are going to make more. And that is true because, you can also vote with your feet if you don't like where you're working. You can say, I'm going to go work in this factory over here and get $1 more an hour. But as people are getting paid more, they want to spend it on things. They're not going to be saving. We're no different today than they were in the 20s in the sense that we all think, oh, we're always going to do well. And so we don't put a lot of money away in savings. So just to look at it, 22 to 28, industrial productivity in the United States as a whole went up 70% in 6 years. The GNP goes up by 40%. Per capita income goes up by 30% in 6 years. I mean, I would love my salary to go up by 30% in 6 years. I don't think it's going to happen. People are getting more and more productive at work. Why? Machines are going to be there. They're going to use more of an assembly line process developed by Henry Ford. Corporate profits are going to go up because, again, if people can't afford things they really, really want, they're just going to go get credit to do it. So it seems like everything is getting stronger and better. Once again, the average increase in incomes is 11%. Over the course of the decade, your actual purchasing power goes up by about 22%. Now, here's kind of an important thing, and it's going to be cut off on the bottom, unfortunately. It says the minimum family income, this is for a year, believed necessary for a good quality of life was $2,500. However, the percentage of families with incomes under $2,500 in 1929 is 71%, which means if you want that good quality of life, oh, I didn't make $2,500, but oh man, I want to go get that radio, or oh, I want to go get that car, or I want to go buy that washing machine, or all these other things. People go, well, maybe I'll just get a loan because I could pay back the loan. We're always going to be fine. There's going to be no problems that show up on the horizon. So they're going to go out there and they get credit, and that's going to turn into a huge problem. Again, people thought an average family needed $2,500, but yet 71% of the people, or 71% of the families, didn't make that. And if we were in class, I would do this on the board with you and give you an opportunity to look at from 1913 to 1920 to 1925, how much more people were earning for things. And you could fill out this chart and you would see by the time you get to the late 1920s, it seems like people are working, and making a lot more. However, you look at the average week, okay, 44 hours, pretty much consistent and standard. A typesetter is going to go down by 4 hours on the average. But you would be able to get, again, look at $1.50 an hour. Woo! And you could see how much better people seem to be doing in the late 1920s. But in reality, they're just going to be trying to spend more and more. It's not like they're saving more and more. So the people who are out there, doing this massive amount of earning are the business owners for the most part. And if you earned more than $100,000, your numbers increased. Or I shouldn't say your numbers, but the numbers of people who made that much money between 22 and 28 went up by 15%. People are making money during the 1920s. And as a result, you do see this living affluent lifestyle, bigger houses and fancier cars. And, they seem to be going out a lot, partying and, just spending money. And of course, people are going to see, the people in their city doing that. They're like, oh, I want to do that. I want to kind of live like that. And they kind of replicate on a lower level. But again, it's not about spending. It's not about saving so much as it is about spending. And everybody mirrors that. The number of people who are earning between $10,000 a year and $100,000 a year goes up by 84%. It almost doubles. Again, more and more people are making more and more money. So, it seems like, what are we going to do with that? Credit, again, although everybody's making more money, it's still not enough for everything they want to do. And in 1925, again, today we talk about credit. We think about, want to buy a house, you want to buy a car, you want to, you can get credit to get a dental procedure, for example. But the total amount of credit available to all Americans combined was a whopping $1.38 billion. Okay, that's not a lot then or now. And in 1927, people are going to be starting to use credit a lot more. 15% of all durable consumer goods. That's your washing machine, your dryer, your dishwasher, things that are going to last a while. Durable consumer goods, 15% are used doing that, but 60% of cars, now today, obviously that's the higher, 80% of all radios were financed. They couldn't just go out and say, here's $10 for a radio. It's not going to get you very far in the 1920s. They're just too expensive. There's too cutting edge. It's even perhaps, and I'm just going to hypothesize, they're even more innovative than say the iPhone is, and they're going to cost more comparatively than a new iPhone does today. So if that previous number was one point something billion dollars, by 1929, Americans are spending $7 billion a year financing things. That number they actually have is three. They keep going out and maybe they pay off credit with more credit, and bank A doesn't know what bank B has necessarily done. What's happening is people are overextending themselves in their ability to repay things. If you can afford a $15 a month installment plan to pay for a washing machine, for example, great. But if you decide to go get a radio where now you're spending $25 a month on top of that, that means you need $40, each month to spend on your credit items in addition to your food and your housing and everything else. And for some people, that may or may not be possible. They're going to overextend themselves with credit in a major, major way instead of biding their time, saving up for things, investing their money, in safe returns. They're all looking about to live this fancy lifestyle in the roaring 20s. And it's no accident that it's called that, because it's all action all the time. Everybody wants to do that. So let's look at cars as an example here for a moment. Oops, hold on a second. What did I just do? Sorry. Hang on a second. Okay, sorry. In the roaring 20s, cars are becoming more and more common. And a Model T, first introduced by Henry Ford, of course, is going to be $850, which is about $20,000 in today's money, which is not a lot. Came in one color, only one color, black. There were very few modifications ever done to the Model T the whole time they made them. And that was the point, was, they're not going to, if you want a different color, they have to go get a different color paint. That's going to cost more. You want, this kind of hubcap, they made them the way they made them. And if you wanted to change something, you could. But because, they started looking for their own resources on things, they eventually got the cost down significantly. You can see by the late 1920s, a brand new Model T right off the factory floor is $290. That's 3 months' salary for the average worker. 3 months' salary, okay, for the average worker. Think what an average new car today costs. If we think an average new car today is $25,000, is that 3 times the monthly salary of the average worker? I don't think so. It's not 3 times my salary for sure. Other people are getting innovative. Some people, you're going to see his name come up here in a moment, Al Sloan. He's going to come up with the idea of model years because he wants to change or tweak something from year to year to make it more exotic or more desirable. And every change requires more tooling or whatever else, but it's going to add to the cost of a car. Henry Ford, by example, his cars are going down in price. Other people's cars generally are going to be going up in price. Some sort of large truck driving around. Probably my dogs are going to start barking here any moment. But if you want to buy a car, including a Model T, most people are going to finance it, even though it's only 3 months of your salary. Because again, if you're going to spend all that money, you can't buy other things. And you want to buy all those things, or you want to already keep paying for those things you've already got. So you're going to say, I'll finance that just like I finance the washer and I finance the dryer and finance the fridge. And that's just how it's going to work. In 1918, 1 in 13 families are going to own a car. By 1929, 80% of American families did so. Hang on just a moment. All right, we're going to try and get this going again here. We had a delivery outside, things that you'll see in my classroom next year, but cars are going to become huge. Everybody wants one because they're getting cheaper and more affordable. As you can see, 4 out of 5 families have one. Again, that's one. Having 2 in the same family is just generally not going to happen. There's more and more cars on the road. And of course, that means that more things related to car manufacturing are going to become important to the economy. 10% of all workers in 25 owe their living to car manufacturing. And how does that work? It's through stuff that, people who need rubber or people make rubber for tires, they're going to be involved in that, glass for windshields and everything else. So There's Al Sloan talking about the model changes that are happening each year. It could be a different color paint that's available, or it could be, this year we're redesigning the front end so that, I don't know, whatever else. But, people are going to be making a lot of purchases of cars on credit, which again, at the beginning of the decade didn't really exist. By 1927-29, 60% of all auto purchases are made using credit. Um, but, oh, geez, sorry, I closed that out. I didn't mean to. Um, but interest rates for cars are about 30%, or it could be as high as 30%. And again, remember in today's world, we're at 0% right now because of the coronavirus. They're trying to sell cars, but there's a hard time keeping cars in stock right now. So it's a real problem if people are out there buying cars with money they don't have. In 1929, 25% of American families bought a new car, which means over the course of 4 years, 100% of American families, might theoretically have a different car. Now, I mean, there are some families who don't need a car, people in New York City, for example. But people are just going to be replacing their cars every 2 years or every 3 years potentially. And in doing so, they're going to, they're just going to be using up an awful lot of stuff, and they're seen as almost disposable. There's 40 auto manufacturers in 1929. Beginning of the decade, there have been 108. Again, the more there are, the more competition there is. The cheaper things are going to cost in the long run because there's so many alternatives for people to buy. Another thing that's going to be happening during that decade, showing the prevalence of the car, is how many miles of roads there are. You're going to see road mileage go up and up and up. It might be a dirt road at first, might have been working just fine for a horse, for example. But as they put more asphalt down, there's more places the car can go. The further they can go now, to go travel between cities or visit grandma or whatever. And it's a huge business, basically, the whole auto industry, which includes the roads, it includes the cars, it includes fuel, it includes everything. Basically, if people are buying cars, then you need to support, what they're doing overall. And a large number of people are engaged in the auto industry. A lot of people are engaged in the construction industry for roads. And it's all because things have gone to a more mechanized industrial standpoint. So the auto industry is important. And, when the auto industry is selling huge amounts of cars every year, they're really, really critical to the economy of the country as a whole. 7% of the nation's workers and 9% of all wages earned nationally in 1929 are because of auto industries. And you can see, again, obviously 90% of the fuel industry, goes towards cars. Rubber, 85% of the rubber used in the United States goes towards cars. What happens if nobody sells a car? That means the rubber industry goes down. All the people they employ goes down, and the grocery stores they shop at don't sell food. And the farmers that the grocery stores buy their food from don't have anybody to buy their products. And again, you can kind of see in a nightmare scenario when the demand spigot turns off, when all of a sudden people are going to be like, oh no, what are we supposed to do? It's going to be a bit of a problem. Another major thing, and this is much closer to home, people start investing in real estate, thinking it's going to be an opportunity for them to get rich. Northerners in particular begin to get attracted to the idea of going down to Florida as it exists then as opposed to now. There's no Wellington, there's no Royal Palm Beach, there's no Palm Beach Gardens. There's West Palm Beach, but that's where the workers live who, for instance, take care of the homes and are the servants of the people in Palm Beach. I mean, again, it's really, really small. Some of the houses of those workers still exist in some of the older parts of West Palm Beach today, and they're seen as very, hip and chic and whatnot, but they're obviously very old. But because more and more people are coming down to Florida and wintering down here, that increases the demand for jobs, for people to support them. Construction industry, for instance, to build the houses, the laborers to do things, a lot of other things. And with the number of people coming down, obviously they're going to all want somewhere to live. And you can't build houses fast enough to satisfy the demands of the population of the workers. So you can see speculation going up where, the cost of a house will go for 200%, 300% more. You could resell it a couple times a year and make a profit each time. And other people saw this as an absolute get-rich-quick scheme. And they invested in land and they invested in buildings, because there was seemingly no way this could possibly lose. You can see in the upper right, land that had sold for $800,000 was being sold for $4 million just a year later. That's just land. Maybe it's a little further away from where development was, but by the next year, they filled in everything in between, and that's the next spot to go. Condos in 1926 in Miami. In some cases, some condos in 1926 are going for $4.5 million. $4.5 million in 1926 dollars, because there's such demand. There's nothing available, and you got to be seen amongst all the cool people, so you want to buy this expensive condo. The problem is that, the construction industry, for instance, needs to keep going, and the servants need to be able to keep going. The problem would be, let's say there's a major hurricane. And a major hurricane, there's like this inlet where all the supplies were coming in by large ships. Let's say, for instance, all the stuff you needed for Home Depot to sell home building stuff with. All of a sudden, the lumber can't come in anymore. That inlet's not available. You have to go much further to the north and then, ship it down some other way. All the rebuilding that's going to be necessary after, a major hurricane strikes, and there's nothing to repair that $4.5 million condo. It suddenly needs a roof. And without a roof, it's not a $4.5 million condo anymore. And basically, you're going to see a combination of a scarcity of products, but also these two hurricanes that come in that are going to just completely collapse what everybody's been doing. They thought there's no way they could lose. And going back to the house my family had before this one, we had our house built there. And it was an average sized home, but at the time that it was happening, there were people who were putting down deposits on two different houses and building two houses. And, literally at the time they were signing, to take possession of the brand new house they were going to move into, they were at the same table, selling the second house to somebody else for huge, crazy profits. And basically paying off their first house because it was seen as such a get rich quick scheme back in the time frame of 2004, 2005. Led to the, again, I'm sort of going a little off track here, but in 2000 to 2005, people were not being asked a lot for, proof that they were credit worthy risks for the banks. People were financing houses that they had no business owning, and banks were like, oh, sure, we'll give you a loan. And nobody thought anything would happen. Well, then the recession happened. And the recession that happened in about 2008 absolutely collapsed everything. And all those people who, for instance, said, oh, I'll just get a second house built and sell it off. Suddenly they owe payments for two houses. They can't afford one. And it was a big, ginormous mess that we seemed to pretty much be recovered from up until about a year ago. And then there you go. So in general, there are people out there from other countries who are making products that are the same as ours and potentially selling them for less. And one of the things we didn't want was competition with people overseas and putting Americans out of business. So in 1922, we had a significant tariff known as the Forney-McCumber Act. And it specifically was supposed to aid American businesses by shutting out foreign stuff that would be in competition with ours. Again, that guaranteed American jobs and made sure our economy was working really well. But truthfully, the people in Europe needed it at the same time. This is how much, and you can see by various amounts in millions of dollars, how much people owed the United States post-World War I. Britain, for example, owes us $4.25 billion. Lithuania owes us $5 million. All these different countries we loan money out to for one reason or another. Perhaps it was during the war so they could buy goods from us to go fight, or maybe it was rebuilding money later on. But the United States is owed $349 million. Let me see. Well, that should be more. If that's 4,207, that'd be $4 billion. So realistically speaking, these countries owe a significant sum of money. France owes about, $3 billion, for example. And all these countries owe money to the United States. And again, we're trying to reduce our expenditures. We're trying to pay down our debt. And this seems great. This is money mostly owed to banks. But what happens when those countries can't pay that money back to the First Bank of Chicago? I'm making it up. If Britain can't pay its loan to, the First Bank of Chicago, the First Bank of Chicago might not be able to pay back the people it borrowed money from, its depositors, the people who deposited their money there and expected to have access to it later on. And during the 1920s, that's going to be a real problem. We did give money to different countries after World War I so they could rebuild. And again, there's a lot of damage in France in particular. There's some in places like England where you read about. Of course, there's other places that just need supplies, food, building supplies, other things, and they're using that. So realistically, if Europe wants to make money, the only way they can really make money is not to sell things to each other because they're all wrecked economically. The only way they can really get any money is if people somewhere who have money are going to spend it. And that would be the United States with our booming economy that wasn't affected, by huge losses in World War I or huge damage. And they're thinking, let's sell stuff to the U.S., because we make good stuff, and then we can pay the U.S. back. Only problem was, wait a minute, you can't sell things in America because that tariff that was just enacted. And we say you can't sell things here, they can't make money here. When they can't make money here, they can't make money. If they can't make money, they can't pay back their loans. Can't pay back their loans. What do you think is going to happen? And that answer is banks are going to fail. Now, the Dawes Plan is something we should have looked at before. This is, again, U.S. loans, for instance, to Germany to save Germany. They do loan $2.5 billion out because Germany has to pay reparations after World War I, which they do, $2 billion there. They pay off the French and the British, for example. They send us their checks. There's money left for Germany to invest in its future. That works really well as long as the U.S. can continue to send money out every year in the form of checks. And I mean that in the form of our banks, not the federal government. Like I said, Germany's going to work really well as long as the banks can keep sending the money out. And if all of a sudden there's no money coming into the banks, they don't have anything to really give back. And I think you can probably see where this is headed. So Europeans couldn't buy things we were making because our stuff was very expensive and they were trying to get credit, but they couldn't. So they couldn't buy our stuff. So we're not selling stuff to a lot of people overseas. Let's see. People are going out there and buying, let's say, that one radio their house needs, but they don't need any more. And the radio companies keep making more. But if everybody who needs one has one and they keep making the same number of radios each year, then that's going to turn into a problem too. Well, you still have problems where people don't have electricity. It's going to be a while. And realistically speaking, everybody who had stuff already had their stuff. And yet you can see warehouses are filling up because they keep on producing goods that they think people are going to buy. But electrification, while it goes up heavily during this period, 331%, there's still huge areas of the Americas that are not going to be electrified by 1929. 50% of American homes are not going to have electricity by 29, whereas 50% do. And I'm sure those manufacturers said, well, they'll get electricity someday, and then we'll have this warehouse full of radios. But meanwhile, if your people are still making radios and putting them into a more and more full warehouse, you're going to be paying them money for stuff you're not getting income for selling. It's going to be a little bit of a problem. And so this video right here, I'm going to have to load separately, but there's a lot of factors coming that are going to cause the Great Depression. And the political and economic factors seen in this presentation should give you an idea of what's going on with that.